I'm going to start today with a story. In fact, I'm going to start with 3 stories. 2 of those stories are fiction, and one of them is non-fiction. And here's the first. This is the story that you can find in many a Marxist vision of the past. It's a view of the world in which we lived in a happy state of primitive communism. A world in which women were merry and free and happy, living this life of Riley until capitalism came along and ruined the utopia. It's a world in which free enterprise was only for men. For the men who've become household names, men like Rockefeller or Henry Ford or J.P. Morgan. It's a vision of the past in which free enterprise has only ever delivered for men, where women have instead been left exploited, vulnerable, and penniless. So that's my first story. That story is, of course, very popular on the far left, but here's another story. Now, this is a story that is currently gaining traction on the far right, in the manosphere. Now, has anybody watched Louis Theroux's latest documentary? Yes. And there was a very prominent social media influencer from the manosphere on that documentary, and he made a claim, a big claim about the past. And his claim, as he stood on his balcony of his Miami apartment looking over Miami, his claim was that men build, invent, and maintain society. That's a fact. Now, I won't give his name because I don't want to embarrass him, because he really should be embarrassed about having made this statement. So, I'm going to be kind to him today, but those of you who've watched that documentary know who he is. Now, that vision of the past, one in which the great civilizations of the past were built, invented, maintained by men, is one that suggests that women instead lived this kind of life for much of history. That women lived the life of a housewife, supporting the men who were building and inventing the economy, the society all around them. In other words, that men were the movers and shakers of economic history. Men were the people, whether they were Genghis Khan and Hernan Cortez or whether they were Henry Ford and J.P. Morgan, that were determining the wealth and poverty of nations. But I think what's interesting is that this story of the past is actually not only one embedded within the manosphere. Actually, I think it is one that is within popular perceptions of the past. Because, ask the average person out there on the street, how many female merchants, entrepreneurs, inventors, bankers from the past can you name? How many? In fact, I was watching a clip from a US news item not so long ago, and the commentator there claimed that there has never been a successful businesswoman in the past, and that modern day prosperity is built almost purely on the efforts of men. And no one in the studio could challenge him because no one could name an example of a woman from the past. So it went unchallenged, that view. But that view is also one, I think, that we can find within a lot of economics textbooks. In a starter level economics textbook, you can find a whole section on how women marched onwards and upwards through the labour market in the 20th century. Buoyed by 2 world wars in which women started to do men's jobs, creating this suggestion that if you go back before the 20th century, women were not particularly active in the economy. That women's involvement in the economy is a recent newfangled thing. And I think that idea is actually quite a risky one, Because if it is a newfangled thing, then perhaps, to be a modern day feminist is to be just a fashion. Not that women's rights are something that can be here one moment and gone the next. That to fight for equality, to fight for the same rights for men and women, is to fight the whole of human evolution, which has been set against us apparently. So that is the second kind of story of the past. And now I'm going to present you with a third story of the past. It's a world in which women were running businesses, in which women were buying and selling. It's a world in which women really were at the heart of the economy. It's a world in which women had their own business cards that they distributed to their clients. It's a world in which we have this business card here, one that I think everyone in the room has in front of them. It's the business card of a female shoemaker. And it tells us that she traded at the boot next door to a pub called the 3 Tons and Runner in Grace Church Street. That's at the heart of the City of London. It tells us that she sold all sorts of men's shoes, boots and slippers, likewise women's, that merchants trading to the plantations could also be furnished with her shoes. So in the context of the time, this was an international businesswoman. Another example, it's for a female chimney sweep. Her name, Mary Vinson. It says that she performs the chimney sweeping business in town or country in the completest manner. It tells us that she's to be heard of at the Sun, the pub called the Sun, in Ormond Street, so again in London, and also at the Swan near Queen's Square. So in other words, if you want a reference, if you want to know whether Mary will do a good job with your chimneys, go and speak to people down the pub, and they will tell you. And then it goes on to say, several of the business go about in my name to prejudice me. So be pleased to inquire if they really are Mary Vinson. So what's she saying here, do we think? Several in the business go about in my name? What do you think she's saying? Any thoughts?
She's got a good reputation.
And other people are trying to, challenge that. In other words, there are other female chimney sweeps out there pretending to be her. But she's not the only female chimney sweep. There are other people out there taking her name, her good reputation, promising to do a good job on your chimney, and then perhaps, not doing a very good job at all, leaving you disappointed. So this is the third story of the past, a story in which women were at the heart of the economy. Okay, so we've got 3 stories. 2 of these are fiction, and one of them is non-fiction. What do we think? Do we buy into the Marxist view of the past? Do we buy into the manosphere in which women were all housewives? Or do we buy into a world in which women were at the heart of the economy? Well, you might not want to put your money on this right now, so let me take you on a journey through the past and try to persuade you in the course of the next 40 minutes or so that this is the non-fiction story. So, I'm going to take you, with the help of my book, Economica, on a journey through the past, from the Stone Age to the modern day. We're going to pass through all of the most glittering civilizations, and we're going to follow the baton of economic prosperity as it moves from one civilization to another throughout the past. And in particular, we're going to be looking for women's involvement in each of those leading civilizations in each of their respective periods of history, in order to test my hypothesis here at the beginning that women were at the heart of the most successful economies throughout history. We are going to find a history filled with female entrepreneurs, merchants and bankers, but we're also going to find that there were many societies where women played a much more constrained role. And so that women's ability to be involved in the economy very much depended on the institutional setting, in particular the degree of economic freedom that women had access to. But we'll see that those economies where women had the greatest economic freedoms were those that most thrived. And in particular, I'm going to argue that the rise of the Western world, that the British Industrial Revolution and the rise of the Western world was the result of an unusually high level of freedoms, not for noble women, but for ordinary women. That it was the invisible hands of ordinary women that sowed the seeds for the rise of the Western world. And I'm going to controversially argue that it wasn't capitalism that put women in a box, it was instead collectives of men. Trade unions, professional societies, and the state that conspired to lock women out of the most lucrative parts of the economy. So in other words, a deviation from free enterprise and free markets. Right, okay, now put your seatbelt on because we're going to be going at breakneck speed. We're going to start in the Stone Age, 9,000 years ago, high up in the Andes, in Peru. Now in 2018, a Stone Age burial was uncovered. It was a body of a hunter. We know it was a hunter because the body was buried with this 24-piece hunting toolkit, and that included some of these sharp, pointed projectiles that you could attach to a stick and then throw at mammals. Up high in the Andes, there isn't much natural vegetation, and so people survived in the Stone Age by catching meat. When this body was discovered, the assumption was it was a male hunter, because in archaeology the assumption has long been if you find a skeleton buried with either hunting tools or with weapons, it must be a man. Man the hunter, surely, it's got to be a man. Anyway, someone thought to scientifically test the skeleton in this case, and what it showed was no, this wasn't a male hunter, this was a female hunter. She must have been a prized hunter. She must have been providing really impressively for her community, because otherwise why would they have buried her with her hunting tools? You know, this was a valuable toolkit. It could have been passed on to the next generation. It could have been recycled. It could have been reused. So the fact that she was buried with it suggests that she was being honoured by her community, that she'd done a lot to provide for her Stone Age economy. Now, it turns out that she wasn't alone. She wasn't the only female hunter in the Stone Age Americas, because since 2018, the skeletons of previous hunters that have been discovered have also been looked at, and it's now been established that 40% of big game hunters in the Americas in the Stone Age, between about 12,000 BC and about 8,000 or 9,000 BC, were women. So 40%. And I think that was a really good place to start the book, Economica, because the idea of man the hunter casts such a shadow over modern day discussions about equality. You know, the idea that men and women are equal, that we're kind of the same. You know, there are people that oppose that on the basis that they think since the Stone Age, men and women have been doing different things, and therefore to fight for equality is to fight history, to fight human evolution. So I wanted to show really that from the very beginning, you know, women were active, doing things that men were doing, helping to provide for their communities. But there's another reason to start in Peru, and Peru, in fact, went on to become one of the first major civilizations in human history. So by 5,000 years ago, there were 5 sophisticated civilizations out there across the global economy. Some of these are better known, some of these are lesser known. Peru is one that has been added to this list relatively recently. I mean, it is one of the most burgeoning archaeological sites in the world right now. New discoveries are being found all of the time. I mean, in the last year, since I wrote and published this book, a whole new Peruvian city has been discovered from ancient times. And another exciting discovery, an observatory through which the ancient Peruvians looked up at the stars, has also recently been discovered. This civilization was one in which exchange was conducted between the coast and then the more highland areas. And we know that because, for example, fish bones and the shells of seafood have been found in rubbish dumps up, in ancient burials up in the highlands. So there was clearly some kind of exchange going on between the interior and the coast. We get the impression that that exchange was probably quite peaceful, because based on the material evidence, there isn't you don't find the kind of imagery of warfare or of slavery that you find in, say, Mesopotamian civilizations in ancient times. So perhaps this was actually, a civilization of relatively peaceful exchange. I mean, it's going to be exciting seeing what more comes to light, because it really is a rapidly growing area of archaeology. And then another place that, with some parallels to Peru, the Indus Valley as well. Again, where you've got clear exchange going on between the coast and the interior. So this spans present-day Pakistan and India. Again, you don't see that the material evidence of things like warfare and slavery suggesting peaceful exchange going on there. What you also find in the Indus is clear evidence of equality between men and women. So, for example, men and women are buried with similar types of grave goods. So, peaceful exchange and gender equality alongside. In terms of other civilizations, ancient Egypt, of course, we all know much more about ancient Egypt. This is the land of the pyramids. But did you know that in the workers' cemetery at the Great Pyramid of Giza, 1/2 of the burials are women? So women were there working alongside men, helping to build the pyramids. And whereas in the past we thought of that labour as being slave labour, increasingly historians think that this was paid labour. Ancient Egypt was a land where women had rights to own property, to set up businesses. They also had the right to divorce. This was a land where men and women were relatively free. It's a land where women owned a greater proportion of the land than is the case today in North Africa and the Middle East. And then we have China of the Yellow River Valley, a place known for the invention of silk. By legend, silk invented by the wife of the Yellow Emperor. When a silkworm fell into her teacup, became moistened by her tea, she tried plucking it out and it started to unravel. And with that, silk was born. And from that time on, silk production was very much seen as a woman's business. And then finally, Mesopotamia. And a less peaceful land. But one thing that unites all of these 5 civilizations 5,000 years ago is the production of cloth. So whilst they varied in terms of how peaceful or not they were, whilst they varied in terms of the degree of free exchange versus state-guided exchange, they did have something in common, and that was the production of cloth and women's dominance within the cloth-producing sector. And let me give you an example. It's an example of a female cloth maker from Mesopotamia. Her name was Lamassi. She lived about 4,000 years ago in what is today Iraq. And we know about her simply because she wrote letters to her husband, who lived 1,200 kilometers away from her in Anatolia, in modern-day Turkey. He lived here, in what was a trading colony, a merchant trading colony in the Bronze Age. Now, she was there in Iraq, running the cloth-making business. It was a family business, so her daughter was involved, and her son was up in the trading colony with his father, trading the cloth made in the family business by women. Now, we have these letters because they weren't written on paper or parchment. They were written on clay. They were written in cuneiform script on clay. That clay hardened with time. And even, the fires and other things that have happened throughout history could not destroy those cuneiform letters. In fact, there's a whole bunch of them that have been found in this trading colony, many of them written by women. And in Lamassi's letters, for example, she writes to her husband, she sends greetings from the family back in Iraq, and she also sends very long lists of all the cloth that she has got together, packaged up, and is sending by pack animal, with an estimate of when she hopes that it would arrive. There was also a degree of discussion that went on by letter between her and her husband, because in one of the letters she says, her husband has clearly criticised the cloth that she had sent previously, because in one of the letters she says, "Who is this man that dare criticise his wife's cloth? Cast him out of my house." And then there's also a note between the daughter and the son, with the daughter complaining to her brother about not returning payment for her cloth quickly enough, and she needed it to buy the raw materials. So this was a family business, probably one of the first multinationals actually in human history, 4,000 years ago. It was clearly trading across borders. Now, this was a really pivotal time in human history, because this was a time of the first global trade boom. The production of bronze sent people far and wide in search of tin. Tin isn't distributed equally across the planet. Tin is distributed very unequally. You have to search far and wide for tin. Copper is a little bit more evenly distributed. So typically people went in search of tin to then bring back home to combine with the copper. So in Anatolia, for example, you had copper mines. So merchants would need to travel to Afghanistan, for example, to get the tin to bring back home. And the bronze that they could produce with that mixture of copper and tin was that was a revolution for the economy, because it allowed you to produce things like tools and weapons that were stronger and more productive than previous ones. And what was it that was paying for this tin that was travelling hundreds of miles? What was the medium of exchange at the time? Cloth. So cloth was one of the first forms of money. Before we had silver coins, before we had banknotes, before we had checkbooks, we had cloth. Cloth had been being produced already for hundreds, thousands of years. And there are three things about cloth that made it highly suitable as a form of money. These relate to the standard properties of something for it to function as money. So firstly, it's non-perishable. If you want to buy something and you pay with vegetables, the person might not want those vegetables from you, because they might want to store the value of what they've been paid in to then use it at a later date. So you don't want vegetables to be your form of money. Whereas cloth, non-perishable. Though sometimes I do wonder when I come up against the London moth. But perhaps here in Buckinghamshire, you don't have to contend with the London moth. If so, I'm very jealous. So first thing, cloth, typically non-perishable. The second thing is that you can judge its quality. Yeah, So you can by feeling it, you can, or by looking at it, you can judge, like silk, for example, from the feel, from the look. You can see whether you want to accept it or not, whether it's good quality or not. So it's something that cloth is something that we can produce everywhere. It takes, it's relatively limited in supply in the sense that it takes effort to produce it. So hopefully that will prevent a kind of massive inflation, things getting out of control. So there are certain properties to cloth that make it an ideal form of money. So women were, through the cloth that they were producing, not just clothing people in the Bronze Age, they were providing the means of exchange for what was the first big trade boom in human history. Women throughout all of those 5 first major civilizations were clearly working very hard, but they weren't all receiving the reward for the hard work that they were doing. So sometimes the women were working, freely of their own accord with their own businesses, as happened with the Massey. But sometimes women were being enslaved in order to produce cloth for other women. And it is quite common in Mesopotamia to find, for example, cloth workshops where you have free women employing enslaved, well, not employing, but making money from enslaved labour to produce the cloth. So women, they're at the heart of the economy, but there was a difference in terms of whether they were free or not to determine how they worked and to keep the reward. There's also something else we can say about the Bronze Age, and that is that over time, women's rights seem to have gone in a negative rather than in a positive direction. And if we were to hold one person responsible for this, his name would be King Hammurabi. So in the 1700s BC, anyone heard of King Hammurabi? Yes, what's he famous for?
For the laws.
Yes. So kind of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that kind of law code. Well, he also introduced the first legal system of guardianship, making women the property of first their fathers and then their husbands. So that was in the 1700s BC. Over time, we start to see women appearing less in legal documents. Not surprising, because if they were the property of their fathers and husbands, their signature, their word didn't count as much as men's. So similarly, when it came to their ability to start businesses, to trade, to buy and sell, if they themselves were property, they didn't have that freedom to do those things that men had. So we start to see women appearing less and less in, for example, the legal records. We start to see women beer sellers disappearing. So taverns were traditionally run by women, and we see fewer and fewer of those. We start to see all female institutions, the equivalent of the convents of the time. More of those were put in the hands of men. So men placed in charge or even closed down altogether. By the close of the second millennium BC, we also find rules in regard to women's clothing. So women told that they had to fully veil, fully cover in order to be respectable. Every woman had to follow this rule, unless they were either an enslaved woman or poor, because clothing became a way of distinguishing the respectable women and those that were seen as on the outside of society. And there were big punishments. If you were an enslaved woman, or if you were a poor woman and you veiled, you were punished harshly for that, for in a sense trying to pass as a respectable woman. So these were increasingly difficult times for women. Women increasingly constrained, and then increasingly marked out and kind of set at war with one another. the Bronze Age economy collapsed. By about 1200 BC, the Bronze Age economies across the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East collapsed. Pyramid builders went on strike, palaces were, burned. Their people struggled with cost of living crises, they struggled to access enough food, people got on small boats across the Mediterranean in search of a better life. I mean, there's a lot of similarity between the Bronze Age collapse and today. I think the rolling back of the rights of 1/2 of your population probably didn't help your economy, and is perhaps the missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle when it comes to explaining that spectacular collapse. I mean, this was a collapse in which whole empires disappeared. It's a collapse in which whole writing systems disappeared. Out of that emerged a new age. So by the first millennium BC, after a period of dark ages, as we emerge from the crisis of the Bronze Age, the first dark ages in human history, a new age, it is the age of iron. Iron, more democratic in an economic sense, because iron was spread much more evenly across the Earth's surface, unlike tin. And so that gave potential for all kinds of economies to start to rise up, to emerge, to grow. This was also the time when the classical economies start to emerge. And perhaps the best known of those classical economies is Greece. And that is the economy that quite dominates our thinking about this period of history. But whilst ancient Athens is known for its playwrights, its poets, its philosophers, even for its politics, it's not so well known for its economy. There are two things that I would say about ancient Athens, and I think they come together. It had an anti-business culture and it had an anti-women culture. And actually, I think those two things often you see together in history. That's why ancient Athens isn't so well known for its economy. It's not surprising. Merchants, people who bought and sold, were looked down on relative to people, cultural figures, people in the art, people in the military, and so on. And women lived very constrained lives in ancient Athens. The guardianship system was very tightly enforced. Women were expected to fully cover and to be secluded within their own homes. So, for me as an economist, I think the much more exciting economies of this period are instead some of these other economies. So we have, for example, the economy of Lydia, which is in this Anatolian region. And Lydia is the place where legend has it that coins were first invented. So this was a very commercial economy. And in fact, the Greeks borrowed the technology of coinage from the Lydians there in Anatolia. And then we have also the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians developed along here, along this coast, the coast of Lebanon. And they became known for their shipping technology, their navigation. So they were big traders in the Eastern Mediterranean. They were also known as the Purple People. I mean, the Phoenicians translates as Purple People because they traded in a sea snail that provided a purple dye. And what's interesting about the Phoenicians is that when you look at burials, you find women buried with the shells of these very expensive sea snails, as well as men buried with them, suggesting that actually both men and women were in the sea snail business. That's why purple cloth has always been seen as so luxurious throughout history and very expensive, and why states have often sought to control who wears purple cloth. It goes back to the Phoenicians and their very valuable purple sea snails. Egypt was really the only one of the great powers from the Bronze Age to survive the Bronze Age collapse, but in a much much weakened state. And then we also see developing out of the Phoenicians over in the north of Africa, Carthage and the empire of Carthage, for which Dido, a woman, is legendarily famous. Carthage, an empire of equals, we might say, a free trading empire that operated across the Mediterranean, peaceful, relatively peaceful, in which regions traded freely. So I think there's a lot more of interest going on than ancient Athens in this particular period. And if you ask me why the Romans overtook the Greeks, it's precisely because the Romans had a much more pro-business culture and a much more pro-women culture. So in the Roman world, women owned ships and shops, and they traded their wine and olive oil right across the Mediterranean in a way that Greek women were much more restricted, much less able to do. And let me give you an example of a female entrepreneur from the Roman world, Julia Felix. So if Donald Trump is the property developer of New York, she was the Donald Trump of Roman Pompeii. So she owned an apartment complex, she owned a recreation and entertainment complex, she had a bar and a dining room, she had a bathhouse where men and women could bathe alongside in the bathhouse, and they could look out on this garden. So you can still see this garden in Julia Felix's property empire in Pompeii today. This is just part of the murals taken from her establishment. And what's fascinating about the way she chose to decorate her recreation and entertainment complex is it's decorated not with scenes from Roman mythology, but with everyday market scenes, with everyday business scenes. So you see, for example, goods being loaded onto a wagon, you see them travelling through the countryside, and then you see them being offloaded in a marketplace. And then you see them being traded in the marketplace. You see bags of money, with coins spilling out of them. So really this was, a building decorated with the ordinary life of business. And what it suggests is that the people who frequented her establishment were people who had made their way in the world through buying and selling, through business. Now, Julia Felix herself built this clearly, lucrative property empire. She, historians think, came from relatively humble roots. So they think she probably descended from a family of freed slaves, and also that she was illegitimate. So she's described in the written sources as the daughter of Spurius. And anyone know what Spurius means? Basically it's big question mark. She's the daughter of big question mark. We don't know who. So, historically, you would think, this was a woman who faced severe disadvantage. Family who came from slavery, and she didn't know who her father was, but she built this property empire. So the Roman world was a world away from ancient Greece, and I personally think that accounts for why the Romans were so much more economically successful than the ancient Greeks, that they had an economy that was firing on two cylinders, not just one. Women were able to engage in the economy. Women had the right to own property and start businesses and to buy and sell. And in fact, if you look at more of the imagery from Pompeii, you'll find imagery, signs from shops, for example, where you see women positioned behind the counter or women in front of the counter. You can find material evidence of, for example, containers there with labels on them, where you can find the names of female sellers. But, much as in the Bronze Age world, this freedom didn't last. As the Roman Republic began to morph into the Roman Empire, women's rights were increasingly constrained. So 2,000 years ago, the Romans began to panic about all of the things that society panics about today. Women choosing not to get married, women choosing to have fewer children, or perhaps no children at all, immigration, a loss of traditional values, traditional ways of life. All of those things some people started to be agitated by. And starting really as early as the Emperor Augustus, emperors decided to fan the flames of that anxiety in order to bring people on side. And so things like making promotions within the Roman imperial structure, making promotions dependent on whether you were married, how many children you had, that type of thing was quite common. And increasingly with it, women were pushed into marriage, pushed into child rearing. Did it help the Roman economy? No. The Roman economy went from rise to fall, and I personally think that tracks the rise and the fall in women's rights and freedoms. That again, women's rights and freedoms are a missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle when it comes to understanding the collapse of this, what had been an amazingly economically successful part of the world. And I do think that, as emperors were increasingly restricting the rights of women, they applied that same methodology to, other groups within the economy. So this was increasingly an economy, for example, based on slave labour as opposed to, free paid labour. An increasingly exploitative slave labour-based economy. It was an economy in which emperors would increasingly set interest rates and set prices, with pricing edicts and setting interest rates, to the point that eventually the whole banking system closed down because banking became so unprofitable because of the restrictions on interest rates that no one wanted to offer banking services anymore. So this was a kind of world of Caesar madness, in which the more the economy deteriorated, the more the emperors thought they had to get in there and control things in order to make things better, and the more they did that, the more it went from bad to worse. So this isn't just a story about constraining women, it's a story about constraining all of us, really. And it didn't work well for the Roman world. Now, as the Roman world disintegrated, the baton of economic prosperity passed somewhere else, to the Middle East. And I want to take you back to Mecca, towards the end of the 6th century, where we can find our next example of a key female figure from economic history. Her name, Khadija, and she was a wealthy female merchant based in Mecca. She traded cloth, animal skins, leather across the Arabian desert. She traded it as far north as the Byzantine Empire, so what survived of the Roman Empire, the kind of bit further east, based around Turkey, present-day Turkey, and then south to Yemen, and then to the east coast of Africa, to places like Ethiopia. So she traded far and wide. She was a very busy lady. As a result, she needed to employ people that she could trust. And she heard about this man, this young man. He had a reputation for working hard. He had a reputation for honesty. That was going to be all important if she needed someone to look after her camels and send them out for miles to trade on her behalf. So she employed this young man. She later went on to propose to him. And soon after they got married, he was up contemplating in a cave on a mountain, and we are told received the word of God. His name was Muhammad. And his wife's wealth, Khadija's wealth, helped to support the initial expansion of Islam across the Arabian desert. But more than that, the example that not just him, but that she set as a merchant, the example she set as a role model was foundational to the resultant expansion of Islam, building this commercial Islamic empire. And boy, was this an extensive empire. So from the middle of the Arabian desert, expanding outwards in all direction. This is the Islamic world by the 9th century. How did Islam expand so successfully? This isn't just a story of conquest. This is a story of trade. Precisely because within the Muslim faith, trade wasn't something to be embarrassed about. It wasn't something to be ashamed about. It was a respectable profession. And precisely because of that, Muslims traded directly with other people. And they took their religion with them. Right at a time when Christians within Europe were embarrassed about, being merchants. And in fact would often contract out their merchant activity to people of other religious faiths. So Islam spread further and faster, in part because it was an economy based on trade, a highly commercial economy. We're talking about a time when Baghdad was 30 times the size of London, when the rate of urbanization was 10 times that of Europe. This was an economic golden age built on trade, built on merchant activity, built on, might not have been perfectly free enterprise and free trade, but built on something close to it. But again, does the success last? No. The baton of economic prosperity is always itching to change hands. History is filled with surprises. A civilization that is amazingly successful 1 minute can be going down the drain the next. And I think, again, this is a story about, sadly, increasing constraints on women over time. And let me give you an example, introduce you to another woman who I think deserves to be known from economic history, Sharjah al-Dawr. She was a woman who lived in the 13th century at the time of the Crusades. So when the Islamic world went up against the Christian world in a fight for the Holy Land. And Sharjah al-Dawr, she had been enslaved as a girl. She was a sex slave in the harem of the Caliph. In fact, at this time within the Islamic world, most caliphs were born of enslaved women. There were more caliphs born of enslaved women than there were of free women. So Sharjah al-Dawr had a really humble start in life. Now, the Islamic ruler of Egypt, in fact, fell in love with her. She was in his harem, he fell in love with her, and they got married. The Crusades are going on. Her husband is busy, helping with battle plans and so on in order to fight the Christian invaders. And during all of that, the husband passes away. Now, Sharjah al-Dawr, his wife, doesn't want to hurt morale at this time. And so rather than announcing to the people of Egypt that the ruler has passed away, she decides to quietly take the reins of power. She is wonderfully successful. Egypt has amazing battle success. She manages to capture the French king, and she holds him to ransom. Well, she holds Europe to ransom. The French send a load of coins to get their king back. Big boost to the Egyptian treasury. The war's won. All this money in the treasury, she comes clean. She's really been ruling Egypt. And the Egyptian people say, great, we love you. Stay there on the throne, ruling Egypt. You're doing a great job, carry on. But the Caliph in Baghdad has overall charge. So whilst you've got, leaders within the different Islamic lands, the Caliph in Baghdad is in overall charge. So she needs to get her rule approved by Baghdad. The Caliph sends a letter back, an open letter to be read out to the Egyptian people. Imagine in the streets and in the courtyards across Egypt. And this letter says, if you cannot find a man to rule you, I must send you one. In other words, despite Shaja al-Durr's successes, she is not fit to rule because she is a woman, simply because she is a woman. Women were increasingly locked out of the public sphere, increasingly forced to veil, increasingly secluded, increasingly restricted in the ways that they could contribute to public life and to the economy. And this sucked the lifeblood out of this, what was a highly commercial economy. Again, you cannot run a successful economy on just one cylinder. You need both cylinders to do so. And so the Islamic world was left very vulnerable. In 1258, just 2 years after the Caliph sent that letter to the Egyptian people, he got his comeuppance. The Mongols swept in, they besieged Baghdad, and he met with a very nasty end. And the baton of economic prosperity with it shifts to the Far East, out of Islamic hands and over into the Far East. Now, this was a world in which women had long been actively engaged in the economy through cloth making. They produced the silk of the Silk Road, a road on which everything was priced in terms of bolts of silk, 40-foot long lustrous packages of silk. And there was a motto that the state promoted: men plough, women weave. Taxes were collected in kind, not just in grain, but in cloth. So every woman could expect to spin and weave cloth for at least 6 weeks a year, 6 weeks to 2 months a year, to contribute to the taxes that her family had to pay to the Chinese state. The Chinese state would then take that cloth and use it to, for example, buy horses for the military, or pay for the anything needed for the state administrative structures. So when it came to this kind of precious silk sector, women were really at the heart of it. But by the time of the Mongol invasions, the Mongol expansions, and then going into the 14th century, silk had a new competitor, and that was cotton cloth. And at the heart of the cotton cloth revolution was a woman. Her name, Wang Dao-po. She lived around the same time as Shaja al-Durr, in fact, and at the age of 10, her parents wanted to marry her off. She didn't much like that idea, so she ran away from home. She travelled down a river, she got on board a boat, and she ended up in Hainan Island. And she fell into the fold of a group of female cloth makers there. They taught her how to become an independent working woman through cloth making. She learnt the skills of cloth making, she learnt all about the machines that they were using, and she built on those ideas. And eventually she went back into the Chinese mainland and brought that knowledge with her. Now, these machines supported made it possible to spin and weave cotton cloth in a way that just hadn't been possible beforehand. And so fired this cotton cloth revolution. And it reached the point where women, by producing cotton cloth, could earn more for their families than their husbands were making in the fields. So this was a lucrative business. One of the inventions was actually like an improved version of a spinning wheel. So with a spinning wheel, you're just able to spin one piece of yarn. Whereas with her machine, you could spin 3 at the same time. So you used your feet as well as your hands, and so you were able to, it was two to 3 times as productive as the previous spinning. And then also a carding machine, so you could take the raw cotton and make it suitable for the spinning, and then weaving too. So, amazingly innovative Wang Dao Po. And this, this really caught on. This made cotton cloth production really, really lucrative. So you would think that this would be good for women. And certainly it propelled China into a golden age. Would this turn out to be good for women? Well, families found a way of extracting the value that women were producing through the cloth production. Any idea how families tried to constrain their daughters in a way that enabled them to extract the value of what they were producing? You wouldn't want them to run away like Wang Dao Po. Yeah.
They did a foot binding.
Foot binding, that's exactly it, foot binding. And foot binding spread further and faster in cloth producing regions of China, as opposed to, say, rice producing regions. So foot binding, we think of it as being like a social thing, but at its roots was this economic drive to render your daughters immobile, so they can't run off and start their own business or find a job and earn a wage. You are effectively chaining them to the spinning wheel, but without a chain. So this practice by which your daughter, when she reaches the age of about 5 or 6, you break her foot, you bend it back on itself, you wrap it in cloth. Of course, it's going to be very painful, it's going to be very bloody, and then you keep doing it. Great for the shoe industry, not great for girls. The number of shoes that the average girl got through, as this kept happening. Women were left hobbled, basically. Why did mothers do this? Why did mothers do this to their own girls? This wasn't just about, you as a parent extracting the value from your daughter by chaining her to your spinning wheel. It was also about marriage. Girls were valuable in the marriage market. There was a bride price. The families of grooms paid for girls because of the value of the cloth that they could produce, but they wanted girls that they could control. So for your daughter to be lucrative on the marriage market, she needs to have her feet bound. So that's why it spreads in cloth producing regions. Now, as I said, cloth making was very lucrative. Families felt that this was the key to their prosperity, family prosperity. The problem is, we're not all great at being cloth makers. And even if we are, we might prefer to be doing something else. Denying women the freedom of choice about how they work and the freedom to keep the rewards that they produced was not a good recipe for securing the future of the Chinese economy. And so much like the golden age of the Middle East, the golden age of China ended in stagnation. Right, so at the same time that Chinese girls were having their feet bound, and that in the Middle East things like veiling and seclusion were spreading, in Europe, thankfully, things were moving in a different direction. Now, I've always been fascinated by the question, how did Europe do it? How did the Western world rise from nothing to become the most successful part of the modern day world? How did Britain have the Industrial Revolution? I've just come back from Manchester, where I've been speaking at the University of Manchester, and whilst there visiting Quarry Bank Mill, one of the leading mills of the British Industrial Revolution. For most of history, Britain was nothing. Britain was a poor country on the periphery of Europe that was, aside from the Roman times, a relatively poor part of the world. All of the interesting economic action throughout history had really taken place beyond Europe. So why was it that Britain had the Industrial Revolution, one that spread across Europe and to America, and with it, how did the West go from relative poverty to prosperity, to become the richest part of the world? I think in order to understand that, we need to bring women into the picture. Because in the centuries running up to the British Industrial Revolution, women in Europe had an unusually high level of freedom compared with, the women in China, the Middle East, and also in India. Another part of the world very much involved in all of that Silk Road trade and so on. And I think we can see women's relative freedoms when we go to any art gallery across Europe. I mean, here are just a selection of images from my travels through. I love going in art galleries and taking photos of any painting where we can see a woman out there in the public sphere, buying and selling, working, or whatever else. Women are visible in European art history. You literally see them, selling fish in fish markets. You see them with baskets of goods going to and from markets. Here, a very famous Renoir, of course, a woman in domestic service there. And here we have the Royal Exchange in London. Okay, it's been rebuilt a couple of times because of fires over history. This is, a recent version of the Royal Exchange. But back in the late 1600s, did you know that 1/2 of the retail space in the Royal Exchange was rented by women? And then we get to these women. Priscilla Wakefield, a woman basically of the era of Bridgerton, Georgian Britain. In 1798, she set up an institution that provided saving facilities for women and children. She set up the first English bank for women and children. She also set up a pension scheme for women, like a private pension scheme whereby you could save on a weekly basis, and then when you reach the age of 70, you could take a pension that's the equivalent to about 2/3 of the present day state pension. She was doing this in the late 1700s. Hetty Green, she was the richest woman in the US in the 19th century, a tycoon. She was sent to New York as a debutante with a pot of cash to spend on dresses and parties. She decided instead to invest in government bonds, and very wise, because she came back home not with a husband but with a small fortune. She kept investing. She had to bail out she did go on to marry, and she had to bail out her husband, I can tell you, because he was not very good at picking railway shares. He lost a lot of money in the railway boom. She tried to resist bailing him out, but the bank that he borrowed from insisted that she was responsible for him, and caused, I'm sure, an argument. She also bailed out New York City twice, when New York City was, going bankrupt for overspending. And she sat at the side of J.P. Morgan in 1907, when J.P. Morgan was working with other bankers and investors to engineer a response to the financial panic that was taking place that year. So women, they weren't just working in domestic service or in service in farming, as milkmaids and so on. They weren't just, running shops. They were investing. They were setting up banks. They were doing all kinds of things, including the chimney sweeping and the shoe selling that we started with at the beginning. In the British Museum is a whole collection of women's business cards from history, and you can find, some extraordinary female entrepreneurs in there. And this is how I think that the ordinary freedoms of women contributed to the rise of the Western world. How this operated in the sense of invisible hands, how the individual decisions made by women about work, family, and fertility contributed at the macro level to lift the economy from poverty to prosperity. So I think there are 5 channels here. The first one, precisely because girls, teenage girls, young women, could go out to work and earn their own living, they were able to take charge of the marriage decision. So whilst women elsewhere in the world were quite commonly married off at a young age, did you know that the average age of marriage of a Western European woman in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s was in her mid-20s? So in Britain, 25 to 26 was the average age that an ordinary woman, if you were a princess, I'm afraid you didn't have that same luxury. In some ways you had less freedoms. If you were an ordinary woman, you went out, you got a job, and you earned your own money, and that meant your parents didn't have the power to marry you off. And so you waited until you found someone of your own choosing. And once you found someone of your own choosing, you didn't want to be absorbed into his family. You wanted to set up your own household. You had a taste of your independence already. You wanted to maintain your independence. So what we see is the development of the nuclear family. Now, a shift away from the extended family towards the nuclear family, in which men and women choose each other, they marry in their mid-20s, and the result is they have smaller families, compared with where women marry younger and are absorbed into these bigger extended families. Now, what does this do? This affects the population dynamics of your economy. An economy in which girls are married off young, producing baby after baby after baby, is a much higher population pressure regime than one in which girls are, in a sense, not using their fertility until their mid-20s, and only then start to have children. So in terms of the population dynamics in your economy, this prevents wages being pushed down to subsistence. And with it provides, a greater incentive for businesses to develop and use machines, because labour is that little bit more expensive than it otherwise would be. So this puts the capital in capitalism. It's not low wages that do that, it's high wages that do that. And what's behind that is the freedoms of ordinary women to make their own decisions, not just about work, but about fertility and marriage. Decisions that are enabled by the ability for girls to go out there in the labour market to earn their own living. Related to that, again, if your average family is smaller, then you're better able to afford to educate the children that you do have. If you've got 5 children as opposed to 10, you're better able to pay for reading and writing lessons, or to pay for an apprenticeship for a son, if not a daughter. Saving and investment, you're better able to afford to save, and even if this isn't being channeled into the formal banking system, it can be channeled into the family business to help grow the family business. So in terms of providing, the technological basis for the economy, the skills, the savings and investment that in turn help to support the technological base of the economy, then again, that's rooted in women's freedom. The capitalist spirit, where does this come from? Well, a world in which your parents make marriage decisions for you is a world in which you're kind of out of control of your life. A world in which you have to go out to work and then you set up your own family household is a world in which you are incentivized, incentivized to work hard, to save, to take advantage of training opportunities, because that's the only way you can afford a personal life. Your parents aren't going to provide it for you. So you have to get out there, you have to do it. So it's a world of tough love, but one where we are really incentivized. So this Protestant work ethic, I think, that people like Max Weber talk about, I don't think it comes from Protestantism. I think it comes from ordinary women going out to work and how that disrupts society and with it the economy. And then finally, institutions, political institutions. We know, that there's a lot of talk about democracy and how important democratic political institutions are. But democratic political institutions do not come from nowhere. When women are going out to work and disrupting the patriarchal hierarchies within the family, they're also sowing the seeds for a transformation of political institutions at the higher level. Because patriarchy within the family is the equivalent of autocracy at the higher level. And in fact, when the English king was fighting for survival in the 17th century, to paraphrase what he said to the English people, if you knock me off my pedestal, my God-given authority to rule, you knock every patriarch within his family off his pedestal. You question the king's right to rule, then everybody's going to be questioning their grandfather's, right to rule within their own family. And similarly, if within the family, people grow up to speak up rather than shut up, they grow up to hold their parents and grandparents to account, to ask questions, then you are socialising democratic value. You're socialising what we need, not only for democracy to get established, but for democracy to persist. So I think that, having an economy in which women are going out there, earning their own money, is feeding through to provide more democratic political institutions as well. So all of this, I think, is the secret story of the British Industrial Revolution and the rise of the West. And let me point you, by way of example, to this. It's a women's pamphlet from the 18th century, a time when parents would buy a book for their daughter, how to live her life, how to avoid making mistakes. And this is my favourite line: "None but a fool will take a wife whose bread must be earned solely by his labour, and who will contribute nothing toward it herself." In other words, daughter, you're going to need to get a job. Don't expect to live the life of a housewife. So where did the trad wife come from? How, this vision of the trad wife, this ideal of the housewife, where did it possibly come from? It came from the 19th century. Now, was it a result of capitalists in the 19th century? Did capitalists all decide we're not employing women anymore? Capitalists to blame? Well, this guy here, union history, prouder than corporate history. This guy seems to think that, corporate history has a lot to answer for, and perhaps trade unions, there's a lot we need to be thankful for. Well, what about when it comes to women's involvement in the economy? Do we have a lot to thank trade unions for? The reality is that the early trade unions, the trade unions that started to develop during the Industrial Revolution, were dominated by men. And they hatched a plan. They hatched a plan to improve the wages and the working conditions of men by locking out one half of the workforce, women. That was their big plan. As one woman wrote in a letter to the Pioneer, "Surely, while they loudly complain of oppression, they will not turn oppressors themselves." How were trade unions able to achieve their goal? Through the threat of strike action. Men collecting together, ganging together, saying to their employers, "Unless you stop employing women, we will go on strike." And some employers gave in. This happened in, for example, in cloth making in Manchester. And in fact, male cloth makers were so successful, not only did they lock women out of the most lucrative parts of the cloth making world, They also locked men who were not related to the existing men in the factory. So to get a job in the factory, you had to be related to someone who already worked there. And then in things like printing and hat making, again, these collectives of men ganging up to push women out of the most lucrative jobs. The economic historian Joyce Burnett, she writes that employers were more likely to fight for the right to hire women than to exclude them from employment. And in fact, if you look at the history of women's involvement within the trade union movement, and Emma Patterson is one of my famous characters there, they had to resist, they had to fight to resist this. They had a big task on their hands. And this wasn't only going on when it came to working class jobs, this was also going on when it came to middle class jobs. So in part as a result of the Industrial Revolution, there was much more clerical work that needed to go on. All of the extra buying and selling in the economy meant more work for lawyers, for accountants, and also for people like doctors. And so in the course of the 19th century, professional societies start to develop, the equivalent of trade unions, but for the learned professions. And they start to gatekeep entry to those professions, to, for example, set up entry requirements, and to rubber stamp, your legitimacy to practice as an accountant or a lawyer or a doctor. And again, what did they do? They locked out women. Now, what's the state doing at the same time? The Factory Acts. The Factory Acts initially aimed at limiting child labour. So in 1833, for example, the Factory Acts limited and stopped the employment of children under 9, and for children between the ages of 9 and 13, limited their daily working hours to 8 hours a day. It's 1833. But the state increasingly saw women alongside children as people that were in need of protection. And so by the 1840s, the state was regulating not only the employment of children, but also the employment of women. So setting maximum hours that women could work. And in the 1840s. What does this do? Well, from the point of view of an employer, it makes women less valuable. You'd much rather employ a man than a woman now, because women are not able to work the length of the working day that men can work. This becomes a reason within the suffragette movement to fight for the right to vote. The right to vote was in part so you could be involved in parliamentary debates, so that this kind of restrictive legislation couldn't be passed without you as a woman having your voice heard. This is a suffragette poster. Here we have a shut door. The door has been slammed in this woman's face, and it says Factory Acts, regulations for women. And she's saying, they have a cheek. I've never been asked. Who's asked me? Okay. The 20th century was one long battle for women to regain the ground that they lost in the 19th century, dismantling a lot of those regulations, a lot of the gatekeeping, a lot of the restrictions that had constrained women's work in the 19th century. So the 20th century, the feminist fight wasn't just about breaking new ground, it was about regaining old ground. Because throughout history, women have been entrepreneurs, merchants, and bankers. It is their involvement in the economy that I think was at the root of not just the rise of the West, but the Bronze Age economies, the Roman, the Islamic world, pre-industrial China. History is, in economic terms, one long and repeated story of rise and decline. It's the story of one civilization after another, amassing great wealth, achieving great things before ending up in a ditch. And you cannot tell that story without putting women's involvement in the economy at the heart of the picture, because every successful civilization in history has been one where women were involved in the economy, and every subsequent collapse has been preceded by a rolling back of women's rights and freedoms, and that was what was going on in the 19th century until it was stopped. And today, I have alarm bells once again ringing in my head, particularly when I listen to what's going on in the manosphere. I think history can often be our greatest ammunition. History provides ammunition to fight the Marxist vision of the past. One where one of the greatest strings to the anti-capitalist bow is a vision of the world in which business has only ever helped men. If you have that vision of the past, why would women support free markets and free enterprise? If you're told that that has only ever been good for men, why would you? You join the ranks of the socialist fight. But similarly, the story on the far right, one in which women have spent history as trad wives, is a story in which civilizations are built purely on men alone, and so what do we have to lose from pushing women supposedly back into the home? So history, when told right, can, I think, be our greatest ammunition. For every J.P. Morgan and Henry Ford, there was a female equivalent. Let's go out into the world. Let's champion those women from the past. Let's seek to change the narrative, to change the way we think about history. And I think if we can do that, we can put women's economic freedoms on a much firmer footing. Thank you.